Oh, wait, man. America.
Heavy snow warnings have been issued for the upper Midwestern states. Expect cold and blistery weather this week as the storm center pushes itself into central Wisconsin. The first 2 days of Wisconsin's 10-day deer hunting season have claimed the lives of 6 hunters. 5 died from accidental gunfire, and 1 from a heart attack.
10-7 investigation, Eddie involved.
Police are probing the grisly scene at the secluded farmhouse of Plainfield handyman Ed Gein, who admitted today that he disemboweled and butchered the body of 58-year-old widow Bernice Wharton. Authorities found the decapitated body hanging in Gein's woodshed, gutted out and strung up by the heels. Investigators have also discovered the head and face of 54-year-old Mary Hogan. Portions of the bodies of 10 or more people have also been found among the other grisly human body parts. 10 human skulls, furniture made of human skin, a box full of noses, tan skin from a human head, a belt made of female nipples, 1 small skull believed to be that of a 6-year-old child. Authorities suspect cannibalism.
Sometimes we remember the 1950s through this kind of Ozzie and Harriet haze of nostalgia.
In the 50s, we caught this sense that everything from now on was going to be all right. And it was like a drug.
It was the era of Doris Day and all of these sappy, sentimental songs. It's very important in terms of putting, I think, the Gein story into context, is the kind of very puritanical sexual code that prevailed at that time. You know, you have a culture in which, for example, on TV, married couples weren't allowed to be shown sleeping in the same bed. That made the Gein crimes horrendously startling to people.
Ed Gein grew up in a small town, Plainfield, Wisconsin.
Plainfield was an utterly nondescript, obscure place, really in the middle of nowhere, and the population has never been more than 600 to 800 people. That area of Wisconsin tends to be a very, very hardscrabble part of the state, sometimes referred to as the Great Dead Heart of Wisconsin. The Geins lived a fairly good distance away from town. When you look at Gein's life, you just have this sense of incredible isolation from any human contact, except with his crazy mother.
And he grew up in a household with an alcoholic and abusive father, and a mother who was very domineering. She was fanatical in her religion and did not want Ed or his brother Henry to have much to do with the outside world because there were sinners out there.
Augusta Gein really smothered her 2 sons and denied them any meaningful relationships with the outside world, and particularly with women.
And also had extreme pathological aversion to anything to do with sex. So Ed grew up with this very, very powerful ambivalence towards his mother. On the one hand, he consciously worshipped and revered her and saw her as a godlike figure, but on another unconscious level, he inevitably developed this terrible resentment and hatred.
There's an ongoing argument about whether sociopaths are born or are created. But I think the very strained circumstances of the Gein household makes an argument that you can turn a child into a monster. Most successful serial killers are the ones who pass undetected.
What kind of a man did you know he was? Rather simple-minded, but I always figured he was just perfectly harmless.
Well, and he's a nice man, just like anybody else. The only difference I'd say in the man, he seems to be a little odd.
He was looked at as the nerdy kid that his contemporaries would poke fun at, which also tended to confirm for him a lot of his mother's paranoia.
Augusta got older, her health failed, she ultimately had a stroke, and she died, and his world collapsed.
It seems that began this downward spiral that totally went out of control. It's quite possible that Eddie Gein had a subclinical psychotic condition that, under these precise set of circumstances, then manifest itself after her death. And the loss of his mother signified the loss of the final person in his life.
One characteristic of schizophrenics that you sometimes find is, they become completely inattentive to their own appearance, and that was reflected in the condition of his house. When people broke into it, it was as though he had reversed the normal process of garbage disposal and, gone to the dump and brought stuff home.
Eddie Gein's house really was a symbolic representation of what was going on in his head. There was total disarray in his head as well, and the house simply was a physical representation of that.
He would have radios, even though he couldn't play them since his house did not have electricity. He kept old dentures around. He had a whole collection of chewed up gum, something that was clearly not as horrific, but that is intensely creepy. One of the things he did was to seal off parts of the house.
He closed off all the other rooms. The rooms with his mother's things, they were just left exactly as she had left them, and moved into just a room and the kitchen, essentially.
He enjoyed reading magazines and newspapers and books about people doing rather bizarre things.
And one of the interesting things that you find when you look at 1950s culture, there was a lot of very lurid, sensationalistic material.
One of the most popular forms of periodical were horror comic books.
Particularly The Vault of Horror and Tales from the Crypt and so on. They were wonderful stories and beautifully illustrated, but they did contain an extreme level of graphic violence.
And they were read not just by kids, but adults as well. People from all walks of life were finding some kind of gratification in the extreme imagery, the slaughterhouse imagery.
And of course, there was a lot of material coming out then about Nazi war crimes. I remember just how terrifying it was to pick up even something as mainstream as Life magazine and see all these images of the death camps. He was also very fascinated by stories about South Sea headhunters, stories of 18th century grave robbers, resurrectionists, as they call them.
And I think that this clearly fueled his own bizarre behavior.
He became really obsessed with these things and finally wanted to act on his obsessions. He started robbing graves.
Gein said that he had begun to do this a few years after his mother's death, that he'd suddenly become possessed by the need to go to the cemetery and to remove the corpses of middle-aged women who reminded him of his mother. He would read the obituaries, and then when some woman died, he would go to the graveyard on the night of her burial, when the soil was still very, very fresh and hadn't settled yet, dig it up and pry open the coffin lid, remove the body, bury the coffin again, leaving the grave, as he put it, in apple pie order, and then take the body back to him and do what he wanted to do with it.
Most psychological assessments of Gein concluded that he was trying to bring his mother back.
He tried to dig up his mother's grave, and apparently when he had gone to the cemetery, he found that he couldn't get at the coffin. Because the soil is so sandy in that part of Wisconsin, coffins are often placed within these concrete vaults.
Sigmund Freud would have an absolute field day with Eddie Gein. He really loved and hated his mother. Because he couldn't have a normal relationship with a woman, he thought that he would take those things that are most significantly associated with a female.
He almost seemed to take a glee in creating novel artifacts out of dead bodies.
He would make belts made out of nipples. He would cut the genitalia out of females.
The investigators found a box full of preserved vulvas, at least one of which was very creepily painted silver and decorated with a little red ribbon.
He used human shin bones to prop up a coffee table. He took the tops of skulls and inverted them and used them for soup bowls. He upholstered a chair in human skin.
The artifact that resonated most powerfully is the skin suit that he made.
He cut the faces off of female corpses and used them as masks.
He flayed the top of the torso of one of his victims and also created some leggings.
And then began to sew together the parts of skin from various female corpses in a Frankenstein-like way.
Gein was very fascinated with the whole notion of transsexualism.